Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Amanda Perez. I'm with the University of Oregon here at the Center on Brain Injury Research and Training. And today we have joining us Laurie Kahn at Moravian College and Dr. Daniel Cullen at the Colonial Intermediate Unit 20. We're so excited to have you both here talking about transition assessment and just a couple of housekeeping things. For those of you who have joined us, we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask questions. Most of those will be answered at the end, but if you do have any concerns, there's a chat box on your right-hand side of your screen. I think it should be the second option down. Go ahead and type messages in there. I will be moderating throughout and happy to answer any of your questions. So that being said, I'm going to turn this over to you guys. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, so my name is Laurie Kahn, and this is Dan Cullen, and we are going to be talking today about transition assessment, specifically focusing around students who have experienced traumatic brain injury. Before we get started in deeper into the webinar, I just want to give you a little overview of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be starting with just an introduction, a little bit about ourselves and our background, and our collaboration. And then we're going to talk about what our intentions are for this webinar and what it is that we want to do. And then we're going to specifically focus on what are transition assessments and what are some of the specific barriers for students who have experienced traumatic brain injury. And then we're going to spend most of our time, I think, going deeper into the application of these big ideas, into understanding how these transition assessments can be utilized, applied, and implemented within a larger community-based setting. And again, we will be wrapping up with questions and comments, but if at any point during this webinar, please feel free to type in a message and let us know if you have any questions or comments, because yes, we could, talk on, but we'd also really appreciate any interaction that would be useful for all of you. So just a little bit about ourselves. My name is Laurie Kahn. I actually did my PhD in special education, secondary education and transition at the University of Oregon. Go Ducks. I am currently an assistant professor of special education and critical disability studies here at a small liberal arts school, Moravian College. And we focus primarily on undergraduate education and teacher certification. And one of the charges that I have is bringing in, so the special education certification in Pennsylvania started, with a K-8 or 6-12, and now they are expanding that. So I'm coming in to bring a transition lens into the ways in which we educate our special education teachers.
Awesome. And my name's Dan Cullen. I am the very proud supervisor of transition services and life skills support for the Colonial Intermediate Unit 20, which is a regional service agency that's connected to the Pennsylvania Department of Ed, where we deliver a whole array of transition services programs for students that would be considered in out-of-district placements. However, in Pennsylvania, those placements are actually housed in the public school systems in students' home districts. So we provide the services through staffing, through professional development, through resource implementation, and through a very detailed assessment process to ensure fidelity and programming for students with complex needs, to also include students that have traumatic brain injury. So that's a little bit about some of the work that I currently do. My EdD is in special ed leadership from Centenary University, another small liberal arts university. Go Cyclones! I've just really, my life's work is just dedicated to help young people maximize their potential and then transition into a place that creates the space and capacity to support their dreams.
Yeah. And Dan and I originally met when he was coming on as an adjunct for an inclusion course, but that was just the beginning, because what came out of it, including this webinar, is this collaboration where my focus, on teacher training and larger systems of research to support students in their transition, students with disabilities in their transition from high school to adult life, and his practice and community-based support systems implementation just started this really incredible collaboration. So we're really excited to speak about just a little piece of that all with you. And we both want to also express our gratitude to Siebert and to all of you who are excited about engaging in this conversation. So just also one little note too before we get started is we just uploaded these slides and the formatting is a little wonky, so at times we might actually have to read out what we see there. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. One of the things that we'd like to do is to give a general, as a learning community here today, to gain a larger understanding about how transition assessments are used, what their purpose is, and also how they can specifically be used to benefit students with traumatic brain injury. We also want to look at how the best practices that engineer post-secondary outcomes for school-age students with traumatic brain injuries can be implemented. And then finally,
we want to build capacity for the implementation of these identified best practices, where we're going to talk specifically about how to take the practices, the assessment data that's gleaned, utilize that into real information that's going to create meaningful, authentic, and purpose-driven outcomes for students that are transitioning into their post-secondary experience.
Right. So understanding, transition assessment and the way that it's utilized to, create transition goals and to support students through community collaboration to gain as much knowledge and skills necessary for a successful transition into adult life is, a constant learning process. So this will just be a glimpse into one dimension of it. But specifically what we're looking at is to demonstrate how transition assessment isn't something that's mutually exclusive from other dimensions of the transition planning process, but instead it's something that can contribute to the ways in which services are provided, collaboration, and larger sort of systems put into place can happen. So, there we go. So what is transition assessment? Basically, it is, for the most part, and this is a quote from Clark 2010, an ongoing and coordinated process that begins the middle school years and continues until students with disabilities graduate or exit the school system. Transition assessments assist students with disabilities and their families to identify and plan for post-secondary goals and adult roles. And we put some emphasis on certain words in this comment because one of the things that's important for us to understand is, transition, yes, under IDEA, under the reauthorization in 2004, needs to begin at 14 or 16, depending on the state legislature, but legislation. But at the same time, best practices have demonstrated over and over, the earlier you begin having these conversations, the better off all of our students are. And also that it's something that shouldn't be sort of like implemented, assessment shouldn't be implemented willy-nilly, but instead it should actually be aligned with the ways in which they foresee their post-secondary goals as well as their adult roles. And I have a quick sort of demonstration of, the first step in education. A copy of the handout. Yeah, I think we can get it at the end, if that's okay. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat box. That it isn't something that stands alone, right? You conduct a transition assessment in the beginning before writing your post-secondary goals and developing your IEP goals and other academic goals, and included with the transition services. But again, it's an ongoing process. So this is one of the slides that's a little wonky. So I typed it up here. So basically, transition assessment is a process for determining a student's PINs. Those are then used to identify appropriate goals, supports, instruction, and services to support transition to adult life. Let me see, actually, I think. So PINs specifically are what we have in the corner here, are those age-appropriate assessments that explore one's preferences, interests, needs, and strengths. So making sure that the assessments that are implemented in order to support students and their post-secondary goals are fully aligned with who they are as an individual, and look at them as from a strength-based perspective to really incorporate what their individual wants and needs are. And so this isn't something that's just a best practice. It's actually something that is law. So IEPs must include measurable post-secondary goals that are based upon these assessments that are based upon their PINs. So related, and it shouldn't just be unidimensional, right? Just having a transition assessment focusing on employment is important, but yeah.
But also too, the IEP under IDEA, it categorizes that transition planning piece, section 3, into 3 identified goals: the independent living goal, the training and educational goal, and then the career goal. So it's a continuum that crosses between the whole human experience, and that's really what transition planning needs to address, are those 3 areas, but then just span the scope and the lifespan, the whole approach, to the holistic approach to identifying exactly where that young person is now, where they want to go in the near future, and then where they aspire to go throughout their lifespan. And that's why the assessment process is so critical, and the onset of it when the students turn 14 as per the transition planning process, to make sure that we're as intentional as we possibly can be to select, adopt, implement, identify, and then plan.
Right. And so when thinking about assessment, sometimes that can seem like an intimidating word, but really what it is it's collecting data that aligns with these questions. So if the assessment is saying, where do I want to, where or what do I want to learn after college, after completing high school? Do I want to go to a post, a vocational training center? Do I want to, go to institution of higher education? Then your transition goals would specifically line with, what does that student need to be able to learn where they want to learn and what they want to learn once they get there. So another example is the assessment would answer the question, where do I want to work after completing high school? And so therefore the transition goals would be, what do I need to learn now to be able to work where I want to after completing high school? And independent living where applicable, but we would argue that that is applicable for all students, that how do I want to live after completing high school would be the assessment goal to find that out. And then the transition goal specifically would ask, what do I need to learn now to be able to live where I want after completing high school? So specifically, thinking about the experiences of students who experienced traumatic brain injury in schools, there are some very specific barriers that they experience and that they face. And so besides just understanding like the individual impairment and what they need supports with, there's also, we know that it occurs sort of often later in life. So if a student is has to start the transition process at age 14, but they don't sustain sustain a traumatic brain injury until later, that could kind of throw a little bit of a wrench in the transition planning process. So with students with TBI, we also have to understand that this planning process can happen, at a later stage, but it's still necessary. There's also a pretty large gap in the training of pre-service teachers and in-service teachers on providing important or needed supports and skills for students who experience a traumatic brain injury. Hence why, CBIRD exists and we're having this webinar here today. There's also a dearth of collaboration opportunities. Do you want to speak just a little bit of that?
Right. Collaboration opportunities are there can be barriers associated with those, because you're looking at healthcare, the healthcare arena, school, home, vocational training opportunities. It really takes the right partner that understands the nature and needs of folks that struggle with barriers associated with traumatic brain injury, to understand then how to identify ways that those folks can maximize their potential. So it's really pulling from the right people, and that takes a lot of legwork to identify a partner of community of partners that can truly be the right fit. And again, we'll use metaphors as we move forward through this presentation. one, establishing partnerships is really like trying on the right pair of shoes. If the shoes don't fit, it's going to be a very uncomfortable experience, to the point where it can actually maybe cause some bruising, if you will. With the right shoe, you can run a marathon in and be very successful doing that. That's why it's so important to find that right fit as you seek to establish a community of partners. And through as we advance through the presentation, we'll talk about ways to do that, and then we'll show some concrete, tangible takeaway experiences that hopefully can be used as learning tools for future partnerships and collaborations to be fostered.
Yeah, excellent. And so thinking also about some of the barriers that exist for students who experience traumatic brain injury, we know, right, that there's also a decreased engagement in school settings, increased dropout rate, up to, I think it was 30% of students who experience traumatic brain injury have faced, suspension and expulsion. So that's way over representation. And so that really demonstrates, a space that isn't something that feels like a good fit for them, a good shoe, if you will. The idea, too, of having to face all of these barriers will continuously, really press on a student's resilience and loss of grit, if you will. But this idea, right, if you're facing so many barriers, then like that sort of self-determination and even their self-efficacy can really be decreased. And again, this isn't due to anything inherent of a person who experiences a TBI, but instead it's because of the constant sort of coming up against ableist practices that put up these barriers, and it's an exhaustion from that. And besides that, there's also, in general, a lack of knowledge on the students and the family's part when it comes to what supports are even available to support them.
And another quick key component to really consider is that the disability traumatic brain injury typically is acquired, as Laurie had mentioned, later on in a student's experience. So they've experienced a bulk of their K-12 daily interaction without these barriers. So now to have these added in, they know what it was like to be without. And in some cases, just the struggle of acceptance and understanding, and then it's relearning. Yes, and it's relearning then how to overcome there's always obstacles regardless of who we are as people, but that changes and how that gets approached. So it's just being cognizant of that component as well.
And from your practices, and this is a question that if you want to type into the box on the side, well, it's on our side, what other types of barriers might have you found for your students when it comes to transition that are specific to the needs of students with traumatic brain injury? So if you want to, type something in, and we'll keep going through, but I'd like to kind of get an idea for some of the barriers that all of you are facing, whether it's professional or personal or, just something that, is research-based or anecdotal. It's all important. So let us know that. Okay, we'll keep moving forward. But specifically, some of the things that we know about transition assessments when it comes to creating goals from those assessments and understanding the pins of preferences, interests, needs, and strengths is understanding some of the things that are specific, right, to students who experience traumatic brain injury. So one of the things, and this is more outcome data, but it's interesting that Women et al. Found was that students who had transition goals, specifically for post-secondary education, right, in one domain of transition, had much higher rates of employment later on when it came at some point towards high school. So, even it's important to have that multidimensional understanding of assessment and goal creation, because even if a student doesn't plan on acquiring any post-secondary education once they leave high school, and that's not their goal at that point, we know that can be really supportive, right, of students and their larger sort of ideas for employment. Also, we know, and this is something we're going to talk about when we're talking about assessment and creation of goals, is that the student active participation is crucial, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you got like heated with that
No,
one.
I get very excited when we talk about activating the students and giving them the opportunity
Yeah.
to advocate. And just something so important here is that the outcome, right? The post-secondary transition outcome. Right now, I'm a father of two small boys, a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I can honestly tell you that, even the 5-year-old, we're guiding both of them, giving them options for where they will possibly want to go when they leave high school. That conversation is having at my dinner table. We're having that now with them, living in the world that we live in. And just to us as parents, it's about, and educators, it's about exposure. So there might be folks that sustain the traumatic brain injury when they're 15, 16, 17, that maybe were on the swim team and maybe thought that they were going to be a rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard. And maybe due to the limitation and some of the barriers that are there, maybe that just is not quite possible. However, it's just coming back to and providing, rethinking the way that the conversation looks, and the love of ocean, the love of being around ships, the love of being around people, helping people.
Yeah.
It's getting back to that discussion. And that's really where, as educators, as service providers, going in and utilizing very intentional assessments to tease out this information, because they're the ones that are activating it. And sometimes it's easy to assume that we know what's best, but what we don't do is we go ahead and we ask. Sometimes assumption can be a barrier for us.
Yeah. And the NTL-STU data shows that. It supports that. Like, we know that at the heart of what we do as parents and as teachers and as educators, right?
Yeah.
Like, the research supports that. The idea that students that were actively engaged and took a leadership role in their own transition planning process and their assessment process had greater levels across the board. And so I think, if you take nothing else away from this conversation, especially for students who might be going through, new identity shifts and new understandings of their own future, that can be such an incredibly powerful piece. And so finally, that's something that we know about. Another thing that we know about specific transition when it comes to the transition planning for young adults with experience in TBI is that importance of not just having student or school or outside agency engagement in the transition planning, but having that be a collaborative process that is cyclical and supportive and fits like the other shoe.
Well said.
Was it?
Well said.
Sometimes I run with metaphors.
That's awesome. No, it's true.
Yeah. So again, this is demonstrating, right, that there's this disconnection. We look at the types of issues, again, not necessarily stemming from like anything inherent of identifying as a person with a TBI, but dealing with these sort of like larger systemic barriers and other sort of social factors that really create this disparity for between students with and without a TBI. So right now we're looking at employment rates and outcomes and like larger planning processes. So, yeah.
Right. And taking a look at this longitudinal data, it does really show. And Melissa, you say, in regards to a barrier in our discussion board, community knowledge of TBI can be a barrier.
Oh, yeah.
You're absolutely correct. And it's interesting. It's a great foreshadow to the conversation that's coming throughout this presentation, where we talk about going out and creating that community of partners, because a big component of that is we have a professional and a personal obligation to our young people to help educate those partners and to help them see things that maybe they didn't see before, and help them go from assumption to understanding that, wait a second, let's have a presumption of competence. Let's presume that they can, and let's ask and identify and find out exactly what's needed. And there's a wonderful formula for being able to blend the two.
So we're going to move on and put a little bit of a face right to this conversation. So this, again, a little wonky. It should say at the starting line, presume they can.
Presume they can.
Exclamation point.
Exclamation point. A huge exclamation point. This is Jacob Fischer. This morning I had the distinct privilege of speaking with his father and got full permission to share his story boldly, fiercely, and with abundance of enthusiasm, because this young man has broken barriers in our intermediate unit, in our region, and in our state. The company that currently, community of partners, when we talk about that, it's the company, it's the shoe store, it's finding the right pair of shoes. Panera Bread, this is a plug for you. Uh, Panera Bread, yes. They have.
We are not profiting from
we
this
are
at
not
all.
profiting at all from Panera.
Just the students.
The students, absolutely. Great disclosure. No, we are so grateful. There's 2,000 stores nationwide that they have open. They have a very rigorous onboarding process. The question was just asked. We have a young man who's got some intellectual barriers. Would it be possible to take a look to see if your cafe might be a fit, and then what could he do there? Because when asked during a comprehensive assessment process where you sit down with Jacob and you do an interest inventory and you find out that food service, caring for others, and being social and being able to complete tasks, see a task get started and see a task get finished within a constricted amount of time were interests of his tied under that food service. We said maybe Panera Bread would check those boxes. So we brought him over, we started giving him some job training there. And then when it came to actually developing a job, it was a very organic conversation with the general manager, and then a barrier was presented in that conversation. What about the onboarding process? There are 3 tests. There's classes, and then there's exams that need to be given in order for a person to be onboarded as a cafe associate. Well, and that training, by the way, happens off-site out of the cafe. Now, for somebody with intellectual barriers, that can become very confusing and very challenging. Passing 3 tests, that can also be very overwhelming. So in the spirit of advocacy and saying, is there anything that we could do, the discussion led to, well, let me just touch base with my human resources department in our corporate offices. Phone call happened there, conversation happened. All of a sudden I get a phone call, and instead of 3 separate trainings, it was 1 training for 3 hours. And then it was, we're going to do it in the cafe, and we're going to use my Chromebook Touch that corporate gave me. So that way he's got a touch screen he can operate off of, and we'll work together identifying common themes from those trainings. And that's how he'll take an oral exam for those 3 exams. It'll be combined into one, and we'll give him the opportunity to really demonstrate that he can work here. He sat down. There's Jacob with his touchscreen Chromebook there on the left. Got through it. 3 hours took him about 2 hours and 15 minutes. Before even he did that, he had his comprehensive interview, had his training, and then there he is as a full-fledged Panera employee there with his associates, building independence. It's just wonderful. And what he's done is they streamlined a corporate process in that Panera Bread organization to create a culture of inclusivity, to make sure now that those pathways are carved for people that have barriers and struggles, because the culture is acceptance in these cafes. He's opened the door for others with an array of disabilities, including traumatic brain injury, to be able to come in, get that support, and provide those opportunities. Very powerful.
And so this brings us into our next idea, right? That the number one piece that's like most crucial, well, besides including the student, I think actually it goes really hand in hand with it, is the idea of presuming competence, right? That our students can and are able to, but it's about figuring out through assessment what it is we can do to support our students to be the most successful as they can be.
Right. So what we did was we identified what we're looking at as 8 power tools that start this process, that take the presumption of competence, the understanding that an individual can accomplish a goal, that can start in one place and end in another with tangible, concrete results. It might look a little differently, but they can. Yes, the reality is there's obstacles, there's barriers, but help navigate through those barriers, just like Panera Bread did as a partnership, to identify a home for a young person, to give them a paying job, competitive employment. The first power tool we're going to offer in this process is believe that they can. That starts with the immediate related service provider, the educator, the teacher, the paraprofessional, the person that's working closely with the young person with a traumatic brain injury. Believe that there are things out there that they can do and do well. and then support that can-do belief through the implementation of a highly intentional assessment process or protocol. Look, there's many opportunities, toolkits that are written in the form of toolkits, transition assessment toolkits, that are backed through the U.S. Department of Education. Siebert, I believe you have identified transition assessments, a bunch of them at each age level that are appropriate, that attack those 3 different areas in the transition plan. The state of Pennsylvania, Patan, they put out a research-based evidence toolkit of transition assessments. And then what you do with that is you put that together and you look at the age of the student, and then you look specifically at what the assessment is designed to do. And then you pair the two, delivering the assessment, and then utilizing, the most important component is utilizing that information to drive authentic, real, meaningful, purposeful activities that are pushing the needle closer for the student to accomplish that post-secondary goal. That is huge. So it's a belief, it's an implementation of a very strong, well put together, intentionally designed assessment process. And we have an example we're going to show you that we do at Colonial Intermediate Unit 20, and then the impact of that example in a few slides. Then we want to do is another power tool we'll give is to redesign perspective on the continuum of services offered. It's about capacity over program. We get caught up so much in what programs do these young people go to. Oh, we have a life skills support class. Oh, we have an autistic support class. Oh, we have a learning support class. Well, instead of looking at those specific classrooms, look at a capacity that could be built across program spaces where
or even outside of programs. In communities.
Yes.
And, right.
Yes, that really provide the space for a young person to be able to utilize that information that they gave as part of the assessment process to drive meaningful and relevant activities that are going to move that needle closer to the goal.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So this is what I'm really excited about is Dan is actually going to talk about what this looks like then in the field, this larger capacity building when it comes to using assessment and building and transition planning for students with traumatic brain injury in a way that, builds that not just self-competence, right? In the individual, but like that community competence where everybody values the mutually beneficial relationship.
Yes, absolutely. It's that capacity. And what this does is we created what we call transition assessment protocol.
Oh, and all these documents too, we will provide for you as well, I think, because I emailed them to Siebert too, so we can upload those and share all of the documents, the transition assessment protocol, as well as the individual assessments as well that Daniel's going to refer to.
Absolutely, and this is a sampling of what we did on a much broader scale. What we did was we looked at the Patan, which is the Pennsylvania Department of Ed Special Education, basically their
in transition.
Yes, in transition, their professional development entity that's linked to the Department of Ed. They came out with the transition assessment toolkit. We looked at Siebert, some assessments that you guys also have posted and have out there in the online space. We looked at the U.S. Department of Labor and Industry, and under their transition, they have a transition resource page. So we've looked at the state, federal, and local levels to adopt transitioned assessments that are evidence-based, meaning that they've been utilized and there are successful outcomes that have been demonstrated by students based on the information gleaned from these assessments. So we were very intentional in where we selected the assessments from. And then we selected them to represent the age level continuum. What do you give at what age, and what is it designed to address? Which component of that transition page in the section 3 of the IEP? Is it the independent living goal? Is it the education and training goal? Is it the employment to career readiness goal? So as you can see here, we have it mapped out, and it goes from 14 all the way to 21. And what we wanted to do is just give a sampling, because With the scope of this, for the scope of this webinar, we could have people from all over the country, and just to get you to really go and look at what your Department of Ed is offering as best practice, what the federal resources are out there, the the Department of Labor and Industry. CBIRD is another great example. There's transition assessment toolkits, looking at those and then utilizing this template to map it all out. So at age 14, our case managers, our special ed teachers at the IU, they are trained annually in this assessment protocol process, where they'll go and they'll say, okay, here are an array of assessments. I'm going to select based on the conversations that I have with the students, presuming and understanding them based on their needs, based on their present ed levels. We're going to go in and we're going to adopt the CIU2 Parent Guardian Transition Planning Survey. We're going to talk to the families. There's one for higher functioning and there's one for lower functioning, get input from the families. Hobby and interest inventory for leisure at age 14, critical. All on a CIU20 program, that's all of our that's autistic support, life skills support, emotional support. We're administering these assessments to tease out the readiness of what's the goal for independent living. Transition skill assessment, self-advocacy and determination. Where are we at in regards to our ability to self-advocate, to demonstrate those resiliency skills? And then from there, where do we go then? What does that information do in regards to it? It gives us the greatest look at how we need to plan activities then that we implement as part of the education program. And I love what you said earlier, Laurie, is it's not just in a classroom, it's not just in a school setting. It's where do you put your transition coaches? You know, instead of taking them maybe out for career readiness, maybe it's all about accessing the community. And over the next couple of slides, we'll show you how we created, using this, a multiple tiered system of secondary transition supports that show a continuum of programs that are looked at more of the capacity that's utilized to create pathways.
And concerning thoughtfully deciding and choosing, the assessments that you utilize, I think, Dan, you talked really well about being able to make sure that, one, it aligns with the student themselves and like what their needs are, but also like knowing where to find those. And one of the things that we'll talk about and we'll provide later is just some resources, but there are lots of spaces. You talked about like CBIRD having toolkits. There's also like a great, I know, matrix that I use quite a bit out of the University of Indiana. I think that's in the tool, that's in the resources for later on, where you can choose by age, disability category and domain of transition. Do you want independent living, et cetera, et cetera. So that way you can, choose things that are really meaningful to your student. Right. And it's not supposed to be just like, oh, these are the transition assessments that we use with all of our students. But again, something that needs to be individualized and to the individual student. Step 2. That should say step 2, apply and implement. Step 2, frame intention.
Right. And to frame the intention. So you've got all this wonderful information from these transition assessments that you've utilized intentionally. They've created some meaningful activities. Now, how do you go about making sure that those activities are written in the form of practical, real-world experiences for our students to continue that ongoing assessment process? So what we did, and this is where you also can look to bring in your community of partners to push outside of the school. So what we did was we took a look at the RTI model through McCrell's research from 2012, where we created that pyramid, and it actually was inverted, remember, and then you had the students, 80 to 90% of everybody received, or 100% of everybody received core instruction, and then those tiers got smaller as they moved regarding the level of intervention that struggling students would receive. What we've done is we've re-inverted the pyramid, we've put it right side up, and what we've done is we've said all students, K to 12 or K to 21, they all get community integration and exploration. That's the leveraging of the community-based instructional trips, field trips. In Pennsylvania now, we have something called the Act 339 Career Readiness Initiative. which is a whole nother initiative in itself, which really creates even a stronger sense of urgency with a state mandate requirement that every student demonstrates evidence that they've taken steps towards identifying their career pathway starting in kindergarten through grade 12. So the state's really pushed for this, and now part of our field trip protocol is, and CBI is, that they've got to be intentional. They've got to be based on the student's strengths and interests starting in kindergarten. And then as we push there, you see 14 to 17, that portion of the pyramid gets smaller because of the age range gets tighter. So that really is where the assessment focus and that process is really examined. Authentic activities then that are gleaned. What we did was, for students in that tier, is that we created a partnership with the St. Luke's University Health Network, which is a huge hospital, regional hospital in our area. And we've found that we can onboard students ages 14 to 17, starting at ages 14, as volunteers. And what we've been able to do is utilize those volunteer opportunities as ways to assess career readiness. And we're only putting kids in those opportunities that want to be there, that have demonstrated interest in care for others, working in food service. There's a whole array of 18 actually opportunities that are there. So we bring students over, we put them there. We bring students out in the community to the YMCA, there's a retirement home that we go to. We do more volunteer work. And what that does is that gives them the chance to really create their personal pathways through a person-centered planning model, which then informs the tier 3, which is that specialized. Where are they going? Are they going to go to the workforce? If so, we have concrete data demonstrating that pathway, and we have about 25 businesses that we partner with, including Panera Bread, that create those bridges into competitive employment. And we also have a host of community service care providers and service organizations, not-for-profits like the Y, like some retirement homes, that we get students involved in to make that post-secondary bridge into day program.
We're actually working on a pathway right now, a collaboration between our teacher education program and the students, to be able to bring students with intellectual disabilities and traumatic brain injury and other impairments to come to our campus and work one-on-one, or not one-on-one, but work in a classroom community with our students who are studying transition at for their teacher certification, and they would do transition courses. I think we're going to start focusing on like financial literacy and moving into other domains of independent living.
Go Hounds!
Yeah, go Hounds!
It's very exciting.
I'm actually looking forward to this class because I need some help with my financial literacy too. We're all in transition.
It's awesome. And here are some concrete, tangible examples then of what that actually looks like, what we just unpacked on the slide previously. We have, this is our St. Luke's program.
Oh, I don't think we can click on it.
Oh, that's okay. Once you open the link, you'll be able to see a news article and even a little video. It made the news and actually was voted by our local workforce board, which is another extension from the state of Pennsylvania through their Department of Industry and Labor. That's where they get their funds. The Lehigh Valley Workforce Board actually named that St. Luke's program one of the top 25 transition programs in the Lehigh Valley in 2019. So there's a nice little article there, and our local news station came out and did a nice piece on that. Yeah. Channel 69 News, they did another piece on that program that's really noteworthy. And then we have what we call a project search program in our continuum of services. That's in the tier 3 part of that pyramid. And that is an international branded post-secondary transition program for high school seniors, where we have up to 12 students a year that they actually take their last year of high school at the resort. They rotate through 3 competitive internships.
Giant indoor water
park
resort.
And you know what? We've had our first lifeguard this year, a young man with intellectual disabilities. We've had students there that have traumatic brain injuries that are now Kalahari employees. It is very, very powerful program because their last year, they're connected by design through an internship model with a post-secondary career. And now we've been in implementation there for 4 years. And now we have We have employees that have been there now training interns to become employees in the same job. It's cyclical and it's wonderful. And there's
career advancement, right? It's students not just getting a job, like we've talked about, but it's moving on and, having the opportunity to train others and to, do something that's really meaningful to them.
The self-efficacy there is just, it's very powerful.
And it all started with transition assessments.
Yes.
And I think we are running out of time, but we could go, on and on about the types of collaboration and pathways that are created through these types of assessments, and to, rethinking the ways in which we provide transition supports to our students from those assessments.
And I just think it's really important too, just to note that, Wayne Gretzky says you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Knowing your students through those assessments creates a galvanizing ability to advocate. You can go sit with the general manager, have a discussion, put your kids at the center of the discussion based on what you know from that transition assessment information that's gleaned through the assessment process, and sky's the limit. Because when Panera came back and said, oh, we got permission through corporate, we're going to give our Chromebook, it's touchscreen, we're able to order one, and we're going to help this young person through. That broke barriers for so many other kids. Powerful. All you got to do, based on the assessment process, based on your knowledge of the kids, ask.
But so these are some of the really big takeaways of, what we're trying to get when we're thinking about implementing, transition assessment, right, is the idea of presuming competence. We're not assessing to be able to see, like, what are they, capable of, and where does that capability stop, right? And because if you have that idea, then you're already setting limitations on that student, and then that will have really real manifestation. So presuming competence and allowing those assessments to fill in those specific preferences, interests, needs, and strengths through data collection to just give you a more informed ability to help that student with their transition planning process. But remember, it all has to be with student involvement at the very, very ground level. Making sure students are involved both in the assessment data collection, so that they are a part of that, right? You're not just asking everyone around them, you are asking them, but also making sure that they really understand what the outcomes of those assessments are. So that way they are able to make decisions and to take a leadership role in their own transition planning process. And in the end, right, it takes a village. So the collaboration from those, like understanding collaboration through those assessments and the data from those assessments to benefit the students, right? Leveraging individual programs and supports that collaboratively build that capacity on a community level to propel that individual student towards their own post-secondary goals and successful outcomes. So I think that is... Yeah.
Good job.
So these are some of the resources that we've been talking about through, and they were supposed to be they are hyperlinked, but I just can't click on them here. But we can provide those to you, but you can also Google any of those things, and those will be the first things to come up as well. Some of the sort of resources that are available to you just via the internet. But otherwise, look, this is kind of meta. You got both of us. So any comments, questions, problem solving that you'd like to do? I think we have about 10 more minutes, and we'd love to hear from you about either, successes that you've had or challenges that you faced. I'm going off screen to blow my nose.
Yep, the handouts will be following the webinar.
Yeah, we'll send them out. Make sure that you all have some examples of those assessments that we've been specifically talking about.
Yep, and we just ask again, really with this, the key is, and again, we'll bring it back to the key word, just intention. Being intentional. It's not just selecting something to select it to go through a motion.
Because IDEA tells you have to.
You have to be intentional. You have to bring it home. You have to identify what the aspiration is. And you might get a student that might say, I'm going to play professional baseball. And maybe prior to the traumatic brain injury, maybe that was truly a reality for that student. But then it's really taking a look at, there are so many opportunities within the realm of professional baseball, minor league baseball, high school baseball to really get a young person involved with. And that could happen right there at their high school. There's minor league club teams, and then there's those major league teams. And folks, there are people there and that are part of those teams that are community liaisons. That's a phone call and a job development conversation. And before you know it, our young person could be on the field supporting some sort of initiative that the team has in a paid role. So they are there. And those conversations come from our conversations with our young people through an assessment process that's highly intentional.
So Betty said two things. She said complete a functional skills competence test, absolutely actually demonstrating the required skills for the job, but not, saying that if you don't have those skills that you won't be able to perform that. Sometimes you might need to rethink the job itself, and sometimes there is that room for that. But yeah. Absolutely.
So the cafe associate position at Panera Bread, there is food prep as part of that. Jacob is not doing food prep. What they've done is they have created a cue card for him, which gives him 5 different. Remember, one of the things he wanted to do based on his interest was start a task, complete a task, right? He wanted to feel like he was accomplishing something. So his schedule's designed for success because if there's 5 tasks that he goes through, he completes, and then he repeats. And then there's a break built in. We're in the process of securing him a Fitbit that's actually going to ring. It's going to, they're wonderful. They vibrate. So when they vibrate, that tells him that it's time to take a break. All of our young people at Kalahari Resorts, they're outfitted with Fitbits, and we live and we operate through that schedule based on those vibrations. There's resources and supports. Just because a job says it needs this, it doesn't need to mean that that's what they're locked into based on a conversation.
I mean, I think about all of, everybody, right, that has a job. Yes, there are certain requirements of the job, but they're within, sorry, we're both battling colds. But even within all of my job responsibilities, right, there are certain things that I excel at, and there are certain things that I still need supports with as my role as a professor. And that doesn't mean that I shouldn't be a professor. It just means that I need to continuously develop those skills. And so keep in mind, right, that our students themselves won't ever be, final products, that they're also continuing to work on specific skills, and there'll be parts of that job that they excel at, and then there'll be other parts, right, that they need supports with. That's just sort of human nature too. And yeah, thank you so much, Betty, for coming. I really appreciate that the message that you wrote there as well, for great info, and especially for our service. And I think that, again, it is, I think this is important to us, but it's also important to the community too. So we feel like we are a part of a larger conversation. I think that question is actually directed to you, yep. Dan. Do you have requests for updating assessment data before exiting, and do your school teams do this? And that's from Heather.
Yes. So the answer to that question is yes and yes. And it truly depends on the student, and then when when those assessments were administered, because we're continuing to administer assessments across a continuum, and we do it multiple times a year. We haven't really, requests vary. Sometimes families say, could you go through and could you give, a comprehensive assessment, as the student's leaving. But if we've gotten the student into their post-secondary outcome prior to or upon graduation, a lot of that information then already has been yielded because they are in their post-secondary outcome at or upon graduation. So it's not necessarily comes down to, that assessment information anymore. It comes that standardized assessment information that we would give through our assessment protocol. What it does is it boils down to really the question of, are those supports going to be sustained? And that's why it's so important, partnerships, the community partnerships, is that students are linked with the appropriate state entity and county entity to continue on with those supports that the IEP team feels, the family feels are most appropriate post-graduation. Yeah. Yeah.
So if there are no other questions, we just really want to express our gratitude for engaging with us. And we think that this is, such a wonderful conversation. And I hope that, if you have any questions as you move forward, or, success stories, please feel free to email us. We'd love to continue this conversation going. And thank you so much, Amanda,
Amanda,
and
thank you.
everybody at Siebert, just for this opportunity.
This
We're
was
really
awesome.
grateful.
Yeah, very.
Oh, thank you both so much. It covered so much ground, and you guys were so dynamic. So we really appreciate you taking the time to go through this so thoroughly. I know, Steffi knows. But we'll definitely forward any questions that we get to people. And then for those who are still online, we do have handouts and a copy of this presentation that will be going onto our Siebert website. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm at pereza@siebert.org. And we look forward to hearing from all of you out there if you have any further questions. So thank you both so much.
Absolutely.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.